Escape from Alcatraz, the truth they hid. The plan that shouldn't have worked. Don't forget, subscribe if you crave the darkest true crime stories that others are too afraid to tell. Hit like, drop your theories in the comments and prepare yourself for a tale that's been buried in shadows for decades. June 12, 1962. The waters of San Francisco Bay were black and merciless that night, whipped by a cold wind that could cut through bone. From the shore, the prison stood like a fortress carved from stone, its spotlight beams slicing through the mist. Alcatraz, the Rock, was where America's most dangerous criminals disappeared behind walls no one believed they could ever escape. But in the silence of Cell Block B, 3 men were proving everyone wrong. Frank Morris, quiet and sharp-eyed, with a mind that worked like a machine. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, hardened by years of failed heists and a life on the run. Their files said they were reckless. But the guards didn't see it. The patience, the obsession, the tiny details that had been collected piece by piece for months. It started with spoons. Ordinary cafeteria spoons smuggled back to their cells. They used them to chip away at crumbling concrete around the vent shafts, hiding their progress behind cardboard painted to look like the wall. Each scrape was muffled by music from Morris's accordion, a haunting sound that drifted down the corridors at night. By the time the guards passed on their rounds, all that remained was silence. The cells were littered with secrets. Stolen wires twisted into tools, motor parts salvaged from the prison workshop, and a set of heads, papier-mâché dummies with real human hair smuggled from the barber shop. The guards thought the prisoners were sleeping. In truth, they were already gone. The most dangerous part wasn't the digging though, it was the water. Everyone knew the bay killed men. Freezing currents dragged even strong swimmers under, and the sharks, though mostly scavengers, added a darker layer of fear. But Frank Morris had calculated everything. They had built a raft from stolen raincoats, sealed with glue, stitched with thread from prison uniforms. A raft that, on paper, should never have floated. That night the cell stood still. Guards glanced in and saw 3 sleeping men, their heads resting calmly on pillows. They moved on. And in the shadowed utility corridor behind the cells, Morris and the Anglins were squeezing their bodies through the vents, dragging with them a raft and paddles carved from stolen wood. What none of them knew was that one man had faltered. Alan West, the 4th conspirator, couldn't fit through the hole he had carved. The cement edge trapped him. He pulled and pulled, sweat slicking his face, his whispers breaking into panicked mutters. The others were already gone. By the time he freed himself, hours had passed. The utility shaft was empty. On the roof, Morris and the Anglins lay flat against the cold concrete, their hearts slamming in their chests as a guard's flashlight beam swept across the yard. Every step was calculated. Down drain pipes, across the utility corridor, and finally to the shoreline where the roar of the bay seemed louder than the guards' footsteps. They inflated the raft, each breath carrying desperation, each tug at the seams risking disaster. And then silence. The dark waves swallowed them. The raft bobbed once, twice, and vanished into the mist. The next morning the head count began. Guards rattled at the bars, called out names. The bodies in the beds didn't stir. One guard pushed the bars open, tapped a shoulder, and the head rolled onto the floor. Papier-mâché hair glued to the scalp. The blood drained from his face as the alarm erupted across the island. Sirens howled, boots thundered, and helicopters sliced the fog above. The Rock had been breached. Searchlights raked the bay, patrol boats churned through the black water. They found nothing. Not a body, not a paddle, not even a scrap of rubber. Official reports would claim the men drowned, pulled into the freezing current. But the prison guards whispered differently. They had seen the craftsmanship. They had seen the patience. The case became a frenzy. The FBI stormed the island, photographing every scrap of evidence. The hole in the cell wall, the raft remnants, the dummies. They scoured the shoreline of Marin County, the docks of San Francisco, the coves and marshes where fugitives might hide. They found fragments. A paddle, some raincoat material, but never the men themselves. And then came the first strange discovery. 2 weeks later, a sealed envelope arrived at the home of a retired prison guard. Inside was a single postcard. No name. No return address. Just 5 words scrawled in ink. "We made it. Tell no one." The handwriting was shaky, almost like it had been written on a rocking surface. Authorities dismissed it as a hoax. But those who knew the men, their families, their friends, weren't so sure. And quietly, a question began to spread from the prison yard to the cafes of San Francisco. What if the impossible had actually worked? The official line was that they drowned. But off the record, investigators whispered another truth, one they didn't dare put on paper. Because weeks later, one of the Anglin brothers' relatives received a photograph in the mail. It showed two men standing against a painted wall, somewhere tropical. Both were smiling. Both wore beards. And both looked exactly like the missing convicts. The FBI called it coincidence. But the family believed otherwise. The escape from Alcatraz wasn't just a crime. It was a ghost story written in saltwater and silence. And when investigators reopened a sealed locker in San Francisco 6 months later, they found something that proved the story wasn't over. Inside was a raincoat. What? Still carrying the smell of the bay. But the locker was rented under a name that no one had ever heard before. The Ghosts of the Bay. The official press release hit the morning papers like a hammer. Escapees presumed dead. Strong currents, cold waters, no chance of survival. The words were meant to reassure the public, to silence rumors before they spread like wildfire. Alcatraz was supposed to be the fortress no one could beat, the ultimate symbol of control in a country battling gangsters, killers, and escape artists who humiliated lesser prisons. But behind closed doors, the FBI wasn't convinced. They'd scoured the shoreline for bodies, none surfaced. They dragged parts of the bay with hooks, nothing. They checked morgues, hospitals, and police stations across the Bay Area. Still silence. It was as if the men had vanished into thin air. The Anglin family received their own visits. Agents knocked on the door of their Florida farmhouse demanding answers. "If they're alive, you tell us," one agent barked, his eyes sweeping across family photos lining the wall. But the mother, Rachel Anglin, only folded her arms. "My boys weren't fools," she said coldly. "If anyone could make it, they could." She was right about one thing. John and Clarence had grown up swimming the icy rivers of Michigan. Cold water wasn't new to them. Meanwhile, Frank Morris's old associates were questioned. A hustler from Kansas City swore he'd once heard Morris say, "If you can outthink the system, you can outlive it." Those words haunted the investigators, who secretly wondered if Morris had finally proved himself right. For months, the FBI kept the pressure on. They interviewed fishermen who swore they'd seen shadows moving in the fog that night. One claimed he'd spotted a makeshift raft drifting north toward Angel Island. Another said he'd found footprints in the mud near Marin County. Too fresh, too clean, too perfect to be coincidence. Yet without bodies, the Bureau couldn't confirm survival. The tension only grew when a sealed locker was discovered in downtown San Francisco, rented under the name Anthony Romero. Inside was a raincoat, damp with the smell of salt water, and a crude map of the Bay Area with red markings along the shorelines. Experts argued over whether the map showed escape routes or landing points. But what unsettled them most wasn't the evidence. It was the date stamped on the rental receipt. The locker had been opened 2 days after the escape. While the FBI worked, the city buzzed with whispers. Taxi drivers claimed to have picked up soaking wet men that night, who spoke little and paid in silence. Dock workers said they'd seen strangers moving supplies in the dead of night. And in one bar in North Beach, a waitress insisted 3 men with accents she couldn't place had bought drinks and left behind wet footprints on the floorboards. It all might have been coincidence. Or it might have been the sound of the rock cracking open. The investigation began to turn darker. In Brazil, 2 years later, a photo emerged of 2 men standing beside a farm. They wore sunglasses, casual shirts, and wide smiles. The FBI analyzed it frame by frame, concluding it was impossible to verify. But the Anglin family insisted it was their boys. "Look at the ears," one relative said, jabbing the picture with her finger. "That's them. I'd know it anywhere." But the most chilling clue came from a police report filed quietly in California. 6 months after the escape, a night watchman at a warehouse claimed he'd been assaulted by 3 men who stole supplies, raincoats, canned food, and a small boat motor. He described one of them as quiet, sharp-eyed, like he was calculating everything. The FBI never confirmed it. But off the record, one agent admitted, that description, it sounded exactly like Frank Morris. Despite the growing pile of leads, Hoover himself ordered the file marked as closed. The story of survival was dangerous. If the public believed the rock could be beaten, the myth of Alcatraz would collapse. The official line would stand, drowned in the bay, no chance of survival. But not everyone inside the Bureau agreed. In whispers they called it the ghost case, a crime that refused to die. Years passed and the trail grew colder. The Anglin brothers' mother received flowers every Mother's Day, delivered anonymously. No card, no note, just roses. One FBI agent kept a file on it, believing the boys were alive and sending a message. Neighbors swore they saw Rachel smile each time the flowers arrived, as if she knew exactly where they came from. Meanwhile, rumors spiraled across South America. A rancher in Brazil claimed to have hired 2 Americans in the late 60s who spoke little Portuguese but worked hard and paid in cash. A retired U.S. Marshal admitted he chased leads as far as Argentina, hunting whispers of fugitives living under new names. But the real turning point came in 1979, when the case was re-examined. A confidential memo surfaced, revealing that pieces of the raft had been found, not drifting into the Pacific, but lodged against Angel Island. That meant the raft hadn't been swept out to sea. It had gone toward land. Investigators wondered, if they made it that far, why stop? Why not disappear completely? The Bureau brushed it aside. They drowned, the reports repeated. They never stood a chance. But one retired guard from Alcatraz told a journalist, "We were told to say that. But I don't believe it. Not for a second." The longer the story dragged on, the more it slipped from official record into legend. Movies were made, books were written, but no one could answer the question that kept gnawing at the heart of the case. Did they die or did they vanish into a new life? And then, decades later, a letter arrived at a police station in San Francisco. It was postmarked 2013, written in shaky handwriting. "My name is John Anglin," it began. "I escaped from Alcatraz in 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. If you broadcast this message, I will turn myself in, but only if I can get medical treatment. This is no joke." The FBI tested the letter for fingerprints, DNA, handwriting comparisons. The results came back inconclusive. Not proven. Not disproven. The file was reopened, briefly. But again, no arrest followed. And quietly, a final note was added to the file. If alive, the men would now be in their 80s. Status unknown. Case unresolved. But what the FBI didn't reveal publicly was that one photograph had been recovered along with the letter. A photograph of 2 old men, sitting on a porch somewhere warm, smiling faintly at the camera. One had Morris's sharp eyes. The other had the unmistakable jawline of Clarence Anglin. It was dismissed as inconclusive, but those who saw it couldn't shake the feeling. Because if it was real, it meant the rock hadn't been broken by water, guards, or walls. It had been beaten by patience. And the truth was still out there, just waiting to be found. But then, in 1986, a fisherman off the coast of Brazil claimed he'd seen something strange, a grave marked only by initials. When investigators finally made the journey, they found a cross with a single set of letters carved into the wood, FM. Could it be Frank Morris? Or was it another layer in a puzzle designed to keep the truth buried? One thing was certain, the trail wasn't cold. It was alive. And when one final phone call reached the Anglin family in 1992 from a blocked number, the voice on the other end spoke only one line before the line went dead. "We never drowned." The truth they hid. The letter. The flowers. The photographs. For decades, the story of the Alcatraz escape was stitched together with fragments, whispers, and half-truths. The government insisted the men drowned, swallowed by the merciless currents of San Francisco Bay. But every shred of evidence, every clue tucked into the cracks of the case, hinted at something darker. Something hidden. By the late 1990s, the escape had become folklore, the kind of story fathers told their sons on fishing boats and journalists rehashed every anniversary. But within the dusty files of the U.S. Marshals Service, the hunt was not over. Unlike the FBI, the Marshals never closed the case. Their mandate was clear: keep pursuing fugitives until proof of death. No bodies. No graves. That meant one thing: Morris and the Anglins were still wanted men. And that's when the trail shifted to South America. A retired police officer from Brazil, long since out of uniform, came forward with a memory he couldn't shake. In 1975, he said 2 Americans had purchased farmland near Rio de Janeiro. They spoke broken Portuguese, paid in U.S. cash, and kept to themselves. The names they used, Roberts and Miller, were aliases, but their description matched the Anglins almost perfectly. When pressed on how he remembered, the officer gave a chilling detail: one of them had a scar across his nose. Just like the photo I saw in the American papers. The Marshals listened. And they began digging. What they uncovered was startling. Property records revealed a small ranch registered to a man named John Roberts, purchased in 1973 with American currency. The deed had since been transferred twice, but neighbors swore the original owners had vanished suddenly in the late 70s, leaving behind a farmhouse, a shed, and whispers of strange visitors. Even stranger was what locals said about the visitors. Men who spoke English. Men who looked older, worn, but always cautious. Men who sometimes vanished for months and reappeared with new clothes, new stories, and money to spend. One Brazilian man, now in his 60s, claimed he'd once been hired to repair the roof of the farmhouse. They were polite, he said, but nervous, always nervous, and they kept asking me if anyone in the village knew their names. The trail should have gone cold there. But it didn't. Because when investigators returned to the site decades later, they discovered something beneath the floorboards of the abandoned shed, a rusted toolbox. Inside were scraps of paper, faded photographs, and a pocket knife engraved with 3 letters, FM. Frank Morris. The papers were strange. One contained a sketch of a coastline that didn't match Brazil. It looked more like the rugged cliffs of California. Another bore names, dozens of them written in block letters, some crossed out. And one scrap carried a date, June 12, 1962, the night of the escape. But the most haunting find was a photograph, black and white, blurred at the edges. 2 men standing side by side, arms crossed, unsmiling. Their faces were older, bearded, lined by years of sun. But even through the grain of the picture, the resemblance was undeniable. The Anglin brothers. The marshals brought the evidence back to the States, but it never reached the public in full. What filtered out was only a line in a buried report. Possibility of escapees surviving into later years cannot be eliminated. Behind the scenes, though, investigators pieced together something bigger. Something that went beyond 3 men breaking free from Alcatraz. They believed Morris and the Anglins hadn't just escaped. They'd planned an entire second life. The evidence suggested contacts on the mainland, criminal associates, perhaps, who had been waiting with supplies, cars, maybe even safe houses. The Anthony Romero locker wasn't random, it was a handoff point. The flowers sent to the Anglin's mother weren't sentiment, they were confirmation. Proof of survival, a message coded in roses. But if the men had made it, why live in silence? Why vanish instead of boasting? Why trade notoriety for shadows? One retired agent had a theory. He claimed Morris wasn't just escaping prison, he was escaping the people hunting him. Old debts, old enemies, perhaps even the mob. And here's where the story twists. Buried deep in bureau files, long hidden from the public, was a connection. Before Alcatraz, Morris had run with a crew out of New Orleans, small-time criminals tied loosely to larger syndicates. The kind of men who made enemies fast. If Morris owed the wrong people, escape might not have been about freedom, it might have been about survival. The Anglins, desperate and loyal, went with him. And if the theory is true, they didn't just vanish to prove the rock could be beaten. They vanished because if they resurfaced, someone far more dangerous than the FBI would have been waiting. That's why the trail keeps shifting south. Brazil. Argentina. Rural corners of South America where fugitives could disappear into dirt roads and jungle heat. Which leads us to the most shocking detail of all. In 2015, Dutch researchers used facial recognition software on that blurred Brazil photograph. The results were chilling. The program scored a near-perfect match to John and Clarence Anglin. 99% probability. Officially, the FBI called it inconclusive. Unofficially, several investigators admitted the tech was too good to ignore. It meant almost certainly the men had lived. But the final layer of the story cuts deeper. In 2018, a sealed envelope surfaced in South America, discovered among the belongings of a deceased American expatriate. Inside was a letter addressed to Rachel. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were legible. "Mother, we did it. We're safe. Don't worry about us. We'll always be watching from a distance." No signature. Just the initials, J, A, and C, A. If authentic, it was the confession the world had been waiting for. Proof that the impossible had happened. Proof that Alcatraz hadn't swallowed them whole. But here's the haunting part. Not long after the letter's discovery, 2 graves were located near a rural cemetery in Brazil. Both unmarked, side by side. Local records listed them only as foreigners. No birth dates. No family. Investigators pushed to exhume the bodies. DNA testing was requested. But before approval came through, the graves were mysteriously emptied. Coffins gone. Soil turned. Who moved them? What? No one ever answered. And that's where the truth ends, not with a body, not with a confession in court, but with shadows moving across borders and stories whispered through generations. Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers really cheat death that night, beating the world's most secure prison? Or did they trade one kind of captivity for another, living as ghosts, forever hunted, forever hiding? The case remains open. The marshals still list them as wanted men. And to this day, if you ask the right people in Brazil, they'll tell you the story of 3 Americans who drank in quiet bars, worked on lonely farms, and always looked over their shoulders. The truth of Alcatraz isn't what they told us. The truth is that the rock was broken. The question is whether the men who broke it ever truly escaped. Because some say they outswam the guards, outsmarted the FBI, and outlived the myth. And others believe the real prison wasn't behind walls or bars. It was the silence they carried for the rest of their lives. One thing is certain. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe because the next case will make you question everything you thought you knew about crime, freedom, and survival.